The night was heavy with dust and silence, broken only by the crackle of a lantern swaying in the wind. Her voice cut through that silence, trembling with anger and heartbreak. "You only want me for one night," she cried, her eyes burning with the pain of every promise broken before him. The cowboy did not flinch, his weathered face illuminated by the faint glow, his hat shadowing eyes that carried more truth than she expected. His reply was steady, unshaken, and it struck deeper than the sting of her accusation. "No, I want a lifetime." Those words lingered, hanging in the air like smoke, daring her to believe what no other man had ever spoken with such certainty. In the Old West, where fleeting nights often mattered more than lasting vows, men rarely spoke of forever. A lifetime was not a promise most dared to make, for tomorrow was never guaranteed when every dawn carried the threat of gunfire, betrayal, or loss. Yet here stood a man willing to stake his soul not on a single night of fleeting desire, but on the fragile hope of something enduring. His voice carried not lust, but conviction, the kind that could steady a storm or tame a wild horse. She turned away, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the doorway. All her life, she had been treated like a moment, a passing shadow in a saloon, a secret to be hidden rather than a heart to be cherished. The cowboy's words cut through years of scars, leaving her breathless with both fear and longing. Could he mean it? Could a man who lived by the gun, who carried the dust of 100 roads on his boots, truly desire something more than a single night? The question pressed against her chest, threatening to break the wall she had built to keep hope out. The cowboy stepped closer, his boots echoing against the wooden floor, not with urgency, but with a quiet patience. "I've ridden through battles," he said, his voice low, steady, "and I've buried too many friends to count. A night fades like a flame in the wind. But a lifetime—" He paused, his gaze holding hers with unshakable resolve. "A lifetime is the only thing worth fighting for." His words were not grand or poetic, but raw, born from a man who had seen too much death to waste what life remained. The lantern flickered, casting their shadows long against the wall, and in that fragile glow, she felt her defenses falter. The world outside was filled with men who would take and leave without a second glance, but this moment was different. His voice, his eyes, the truth carved deep into his weathered face. They all spoke the same vow, and though her heart still trembled with doubt, something inside her whispered that perhaps, for the first time, she was not being asked to surrender for a night. She was being offered a forever. The weight of his words lingered in the air long after they were spoken, like smoke curling from the barrel of a freshly fired gun. She stood frozen, her breath shallow, as if the very ground beneath her boots had shifted. No man had ever looked at her the way he did, not as a fleeting distraction or a nameless comfort, but as someone he was willing to bind his life to. In the Old West, where permanence was a rarity and loss was a certainty, the idea of a lifetime seemed almost impossible. Yet the fire in his eyes made it feel less like a promise and more like an unshakable truth. Her past clawed at her heart, filling her with doubt. She had lived through enough betrayals to know how quickly a man's words could turn to dust. Men of the frontier were quick to whisper love at night, and quicker still to vanish with the dawn. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his vow was different, but the scars of broken promises burned too deeply. "Words are easy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The wind carries them away. Why should I believe yours will stay?" The cowboy took a slow step closer, his spurs clinking softly against the wooden floor. His face was carved by years of hardship, his eyes heavy with battles seen and burdens carried. Yet in that moment, he was not a gunfighter or a rancher hardened by loss. He was simply a man laying down his truth. "Because I know what it is to lose everything," he said quietly, "and I won't waste what's left of me on anything less than forever." The sincerity in his tone cut through the wall she had built, striking deeper than any grand gesture could. The silence between them stretched, heavy and trembling, as the storm outside rattled the windows. She studied him, her heart caught between suspicion and a fragile spark of hope. He did not reach for her, did not push or demand. He simply stood there, waiting, his truth laid bare. And it was that patience, that refusal to force her hand, that made his words feel stronger than steel. In a land where men were quick to take, his willingness to wait was a rare and disarming kind of courage. Her hand brushed against the edge of the table, steadying herself as tears stung her eyes. For so long she had believed that her worth was measured in nights, in fleeting glances, in whispers swallowed by darkness. Yet here was a man saying she was worth years, worth decades, worth the weight of a lifetime. It terrified her, but it also awakened something she thought had long been buried, the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she could be more than a moment. The cowboy's patience held like the stillness before dawn. He made no move to close the distance, as though he understood that this battle was not one of touch or words, but of trust hard-won. His voice, steady and low, broke the silence again. "A night is for men who don't plan to wake up tomorrow," he said. "But me, I've seen too many mornings to know I can't keep living that way. I want something that lasts when the nights fade and the dust settles." His words were not poetry, but they carried the grit of lived truth, the kind forged on battlefields and lonely roads. She looked away, her thoughts tangled like wild horses, each pulling her in a different direction. Part of her longed to run, to guard the fragile shell around her heart before it shattered again. But another part, the part that had been silenced for years, wanted to believe that she could be loved beyond a fleeting night, that she could be someone's forever in a world that gave nothing easily. The conflict twisted inside her, leaving her trembling with both fear and desire. The storm outside roared louder, thunder rolling across the plains like drums of war. The cowboy lifted his gaze toward the window, his expression solemn. "This land teaches us to fight for what matters," he said softly. "The weather, the hunger, the loneliness, they all test a man. But they also teach him to hold on to what's real. In you," he paused, his voice tightening, "you're the only thing I've ever found worth holding on to." The vulnerability in his tone was raw, unpolished, and utterly disarming. Her defenses cracked under the weight of his words, but still she struggled. Memories of men who had left her behind whispered like ghosts, telling her not to believe, not to trust. "How do I know you won't ride away when the road calls?" she asked, her voice sharp with the fear she tried to mask. The question hung heavy, not as an accusation, but as a desperate plea for reassurance. The cowboy stepped closer then, his hand resting over his chest, his eyes locked onto hers with unyielding resolve. "Because I've spent too long riding roads that led nowhere," he said, "and I'm done searching. The road ends here, with you. That's my truth." His words struck like a brand against her heart, leaving her breathless. For the first time, she saw not just a cowboy hardened by dust and blood, but a man who had chosen her as the one thing he would not let go. The storm outside broke into silence, but inside the small cabin the air remained thick, charged with something greater than thunder. She stood staring at him, torn between disbelief and the quiet yearning that tugged at her heart. His words had shaken her walls, yet she knew the West was a place where words meant little unless they were carried by action. Men had sworn devotion under starlit skies before, only to vanish come morning. She would not let herself fall for promises unless they were proven with the weight of sacrifice. The cowboy seemed to read the battle in her eyes. He did not push her, did not fill the silence with empty vows. Instead, he lowered his hat, his voice steady as he spoke. "A lifetime can't be built on speeches," he said. "It has to be lived, one day at a time. So let me show you. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but every sunrise after." His tone was quiet but firm, and in it was the same grit that drove men to carve out homes from unforgiving plains. He was not asking her to believe blindly. He was offering her the proof of time itself. Her chest tightened, her breath trembling with the weight of his vow. She wanted to believe, but fear still coiled inside her like a rattlesnake ready to strike. "Men don't stay," she whispered, the pain raw in her voice. "They want the thrill of a chase, not the burden of forever. What makes you different?" Her question was not born of doubt in him, but of the scars that haunted her, the memories of every night she had been left alone in the silence of dawn. The cowboy's eyes softened, though his stance remained strong. He stepped closer, the floor creaking under his boots, and gently lifted her chin so their eyes met. Because I know what it is to wake up to nothing, he said, his words sharp with truth. I've had nights filled with whiskey and dust, but they left me emptier than I was before. I'm done chasing shadows. What I want now is something real, something worth waking up to, and I see that in you. His hand fell away, leaving only the weight of his honesty lingering in the air. Her heart cracked open, caught between fear and a fragile hope. For the first time, she saw not just the cowboy standing before her, but the man he had become through loss, hardship, and longing. And in that reflection, she recognized a truth she had buried deep inside herself. She was not afraid of love. She was afraid of losing it. The following days unfolded like the slow bloom of dawn across the prairie. The cowboy's words had not erased her doubts, but his actions began to speak where words could not. He tended the fire before she rose in the morning, repaired the creaking boards on the porch without being asked, and rode into town not for drink or gambling, but for flour and fabric she had mentioned only once in passing. Each small act was a stitch in the fabric of the promise he had made, not for one night, but for a lifetime. She watched him with wary eyes, her heart caught between caution and wonder. The West had hardened her into someone who trusted only what she could hold in her hands. Yet here was a man proving, day by day, that trust could be built in quiet persistence. It was not the grand declarations that moved her most, but the way he chose her in every decision, as though her presence was not a burden but a compass. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she began to let the walls around her heart lower. But peace on the frontier was never left untouched. Whispers spread through the town that the cowboy had grown soft, that he was wasting himself on a woman instead of chasing land, cattle, and coin. Men at the saloon mocked his devotion, calling it weakness, and others warned her that a man who tied himself down would eventually regret it. She heard their words, felt their sting, and the doubts inside her stirred again like a restless storm. The cowboy, however, did not waver. When he heard the whispers, he met them with silence, his jaw set, his eyes unshaken. They don't understand, he told her one evening as the sun bled into the horizon. But I'm not living for them. I'm living for what's here with you. His voice carried no anger, only certainty, and it steadied her even as doubt pressed close. For in a land where men were defined by conquest, he had chosen a different kind of victory, one not won with guns or gold, but with loyalty. And in that choice, she began to see the truth of his vow. A night could be claimed with passion, but a lifetime could only be built with sacrifice. And though the West threatened to tear them apart with its harsh winds and harder men, she felt the fragile roots of forever beginning to take hold. The first trial of his vow came sooner than either of them expected. One evening, as the prairie bled into the deep crimson of dusk, riders appeared on the horizon. Dust rose in long trails behind them, and the sound of hooves carried across the land like distant thunder. She stood at the window, fear tightening her chest, for she recognized the markings on their saddles. Men who belonged to no law, bandits who took what they wanted and left ruin behind. Their arrival meant trouble, and she knew trouble had a way of testing every promise made in the quiet of night. The cowboy stepped onto the porch, his rifle leaning against the doorway. His face was calm, his shoulders squared, but inside, he understood the weight of this moment. A night of words would mean nothing if he faltered now. He turned to her, his voice steady. Stay inside. Lock the door. Whatever happens, know this. I meant what I said. His eyes lingered on hers, carrying a lifetime's worth of vows in a single glance. And then he turned to face the riders who closed in like wolves. The bandits dismounted, their laughter sharp, their eyes filled with hunger for both land and power. They mocked his solitude, questioned why a man would waste his life on a ranch that barely stood, and sneered at the thought of tying himself to one woman. Their leader, a scarred man with cruelty etched across his grin, spat into the dirt and said, Men like you never last. Women are for nights, not for lifetimes. The words were meant to cut, to break his resolve, but the cowboy's jaw only tightened, his silence sharper than steel. She watched from behind the window, her heart hammering in her chest. Doubt clawed at her again, whispering that maybe the world outside was right, that promises of forever were foolish in a land built on dust and blood. But then she saw the way he stood, unflinching, his shadow stretching long across the dirt as the sun slipped lower. He did not waver. He had not backed down. And in that stillness, she realized he was fighting not just for himself, not just for her, but for the truth of every word he had spoken. When the bandits threatened to burn the ranch if he did not yield, the cowboy raised his voice for the first time, steady and firm. This house, this land, this woman, it's all I've got. And it's enough. You won't take it. Not while I draw breath. His defiance struck like thunder, shaking even the hardened hearts before him. For in a land where most men lived only for the next night, here was one who staked his life on forever. The standoff stretched long into the fading light. The bandits, sensing the steel in his resolve, grew restless. Guns were drawn, words sharpened into threats, and the air itself seemed ready to ignite. She clutched the edge of the window frame, torn between fear and awe, her heart breaking at the sight of the man who stood willing to die for a promise she had once doubted. It was in that moment she understood the weight of his vow. Not a dream, not a fleeting passion, but a lifetime he was prepared to defend even against death itself. The leader laughed cruelly, though his voice carried unease. One man against many? You'll lose. But the cowboy's eyes did not flicker. He shifted his stance, hand resting near the grip of his rifle, his voice low but unyielding. Then let me lose fighting for something real. I've lost enough chasing shadows. The words fell heavy into the dust, silencing even the laughter of his enemies. In that instant, the bandits saw not a lone rancher, but a man who had chosen his ground and would not leave it. Inside, tears welled in her eyes, not from fear but from something deeper. She had spent her life believing men only wanted a night, but here was proof written in defiance and dust that one man could want more, that he could want all. And for the first time, she felt the fragile weight of trust settle in her chest, steadying her trembling heart. The tension broke in a sudden blur of motion. One of the bandits stepped forward, his pistol drawn, but the cowboy was quicker. A single shot cracked through the night, and silence fell heavy. Dust swirled as the man collapsed, and the others froze, realizing they were not facing a fool, but a man who meant every word he had spoken. Fear replaced their bravado, and one by one, they mounted their horses, retreating into the darkness, their threats scattered by the wind. When the last rider vanished into the horizon, the cowboy lowered his rifle and turned back toward the cabin. His face was weary, his shoulders heavy, but his eyes held the same unshaken fire. She rushed out to meet him, tears streaking her face, and before she could speak, he said softly, "A lifetime, remember? That's what I'm here for." And in that moment, with the stars breaking open above them, she knew his vow had been carved not just in words, but in the very dust of the West itself. News of the standoff spread faster than prairie fire. By the next morning, the town was alive with whispers of the cowboy who had faced down a band of outlaws for the sake of his land, and for the woman who stood at his side. Some men at the saloon scoffed, calling it foolishness to risk a life for something as fragile as love. Others, more quietly, admitted admiration for the kind of resolve most had never seen. Yet in the West, admiration and envy often walked hand in hand, and not every ear that heard the tale heard it kindly. The woman felt the weight of every stare when she stepped into town. Mothers hushed their children as she passed, while others shook their heads, as if to warn her that men like him were destined to break hearts, no matter how fiercely they swore otherwise. She carried those glances like stones in her chest, each one pressing against the fragile trust she was building. But when she returned to the ranch and found him mending the fence as though nothing had changed, she saw in his quiet persistence the answer to their doubts. He did not need to prove himself with words. He proved it with every action. The cowboy himself cared little for the gossip. His hands were busy, his back bent to work, and his eyes fixed on the horizon as though watching for storms others couldn't see. "Let them talk," he said one evening as the fire burned low. "They don't know what it's like to stand with nothing left, but what matters most." His voice was calm, not bitter, but steady with the kind of conviction that could not be shaken by idle tongues. And though her fears lingered, his steadiness began to quiet them like a lullaby after a long, restless night. Still, the West never forgot debts. The bandits who had fled left behind whispers of vengeance, and she feared their shadow would one day return. Yet the cowboy never faltered. Each night he sat by the window with his rifle across his lap, not in paranoia, but in readiness. And each morning he woke with the same patience, the same gentleness, as though reminding her that no threat could make him abandon what he had chosen. His consistency became her anchor, grounding her in ways no fleeting passion ever had. The woman began to realize that his promise of a lifetime was not a single vow. It was lived in the rhythm of their days. In the way he drew water before she asked, in the way he fixed a broken hinge, in the way his eyes softened when they met hers at sunset. Slowly, the fear of being left behind began to fade, replaced by something steadier, deeper, a fragile but growing belief that she was not just surviving in a shadow. She was part of the life he was building. But peace on the frontier was always fragile, as fleeting as the morning mist. One afternoon, a group of townsfolk arrived at the ranch, their faces drawn tight with worry. They warned of cattle raids and supplies stolen along the trade road, whispering that the same bandits might be circling back, and that the ranch, so openly defiant, would surely be their first target. Fear made their voices sharp, and suspicion pointed their eyes toward her, as though she were the weakness that had tempted him into folly. The cowboy listened without interruption, his hand steady as he leaned on the porch rail. When they demanded he reconsider his choices, that he abandon his so-called burden before it brought ruin on them all, his reply was simple, unshaken. "What you call a burden, I call my reason." The words struck with the quiet force of a hammer, silencing their protests. Yet silence did not mean acceptance. They left with muttered curses, their mistrust lingering like dust on the horizon. That night, she sat beside him by the fire, her heart heavy. "They'll never forgive me," she whispered. "They'll never forgive you for choosing me." Her voice cracked with the weight of fear, of not belonging, of being the cause of danger and division. For a moment, the old doubt crept back in, whispering that perhaps the town was right, that perhaps one night would have been easier than a lifetime marked by struggle. The cowboy turned to her, his face lit by the flicker of firelight, and shook his head. "I didn't choose the easy road. I chose the right one, and I'll walk it with you, no matter how rough it gets." His words carried no hesitation, no tremor, only the raw, steady truth of a man who had already decided. He reached for her hand, calloused fingers wrapping around hers, and she felt in his grip the strength of someone who had weathered storms far worse and still stood unbroken. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and silent, holding the promise of danger and dawn alike. But within the cabin, as the fire crackled low, she felt for the first time that forever was not just possible. It was already unfolding, one choice, one sacrifice, one moment at a time. And in the steady presence of the man who had sworn her a lifetime, she began to believe that even in the unforgiving West, love could carve its place into the dust. The return of the bandits was not a surprise. In the Old West, vengeance was a language men spoke fluently, and defeat only sharpened their hunger. Word reached the ranch that they had been gathering strength, robbing travelers, and planning to strike harder than before. She felt the dread coil inside her, memories of their first standoff replaying in her mind. But when she looked at the cowboy, she saw no fear, only the same steady fire that had carried him through every trial. He had promised her a lifetime, and that vow was not made of words alone. It was carved into his resolve. The first signs came at dawn, the horizon darkening with dust as riders approached. She stood at the window, her heart pounding, while the cowboy saddled his horse and checked his rifle with practiced calm. He turned to her once, his eyes soft against the steel of his face. "This is the cost of forever," he said gently. "But it's a price I'll pay as many times as I need." His voice did not shake, and though fear still burned in her chest, those words settled into her like an anchor. The bandits rode closer, their numbers doubled since the last encounter. Their leader dismounted with a sneer, his eyes fixed on the cowboy, as if the earth itself was not wide enough for the both of them. "You think you can defy me twice?" he spat, his voice cutting through the dry morning air. "You think a woman is worth all this trouble?" His words dripped with mockery, but beneath the surface was fury, fury that his pride had been broken before this man and this woman who refused to bow. The cowboy stood tall, his rifle loose in his hand but his stance unyielding. "She's worth more than every breath I've got left," he said, his voice carrying across the land like a bell tolling in the silence. His words silenced even the bandits for a moment, their bravado shaken by the raw certainty in his tone. For he was not bluffing, not pretending. He was declaring a truth deeper than bullets, a truth that every man there felt in the marrow of his bones. She stepped onto the porch then, defying her own fear, her eyes blazing with the same fire she saw in him. "If you want him," she said, her voice trembling yet strong, "you'll have to go through me too." The bandits jeered, laughing at the sight of a woman standing beside him. But the cowboy did not laugh. Instead, he placed his hand over hers, steady and sure. Together, they stood, a line drawn in dust and dawn, daring the West itself to test the strength of their promise. The battle that followed was swift and brutal, the kind of clash the West was built upon. Rifles cracked, horses reared, and the air filled with the thunder of hooves and the fire of defiance. The cowboy fought with the precision of a man who had lived too many nights ready for death, his every shot deliberate, his every move carved with determination. Yet it was not rage that guided him. It was love, burning steady in his chest, the promise of a lifetime giving him strength greater than steel. She did not hide inside the cabin this time. With trembling hands, she carried ammunition to his side, her fear transformed into resolve. Every cartridge she pressed into his palm was a vow of her own, that she would not let him stand alone, that his promise was also hers to defend. Her courage lit something fierce in him, and together they held the line, their defiance echoing louder than the gunfire itself. When the dust finally cleared, the bandits lay scattered, broken by a force they had never understood. It was not just the cowboy's skill that had defeated them, nor the bullets fired in the chaos of dawn. It was something stronger, something no outlaw could ever take. A bond forged in fire, in fear, in the unyielding resolve of two souls who had chosen to stand side by side, no matter the cost. The survivors fled into the horizon, their leaders silenced forever, leaving behind only the echo of defeat. The prairie grew quiet once more, the only sound the soft wind carrying away the smoke of battle. She turned to him, her face streaked with tears and dust, and in that silence, she saw the truth of his vow. He had not promised her safety, nor a life free of trials. He had promised her a lifetime, with all its storms, its battles, and its fleeting moments of peace. And he had proven, with blood and fire, that he would defend it until his last breath. Hand in hand, they stood on the porch as the sun rose, casting its golden light over the battered land. Their home was scarred, their bodies weary, but their hearts were bound in a way no night of passion ever could. In a world where men were often remembered for what they took, this cowboy would be remembered for what he gave, a vow of forever, and the courage to fight for it, even when the West itself rose against him. The West was never a land of easy promises. It was a place where men rose and fell with the sun, where dust buried more dreams than it ever carried. And yet, against that unforgiving backdrop, a cowboy dared to say what most men feared, that one night was not enough, that only a lifetime was worth the fight. His vow was not carved in poetry or sealed in gold. It was proven in sweat, in sacrifice, and in the blood spilled when danger came to his door. In a world where forever seemed impossible, he chose to make it real. The woman who once trembled at the thought of trust found herself transformed in the fire of his resolve. She saw that love was not weakness, but the fiercest strength a man or woman could wield. Together they stood when others mocked. Together they fought when outlaws tested them. And together they endured when the world demanded they surrender. Their story was not about fleeting passion, but about a vow that held steady through storms and silence alike. The lesson carved into their lives is one that still whispers through time. Words alone are fragile, but when backed by action, they become unbreakable. The cowboy's lifetime was not promised in comfort, but in devotion. And perhaps that is what true love is, not a shield against hardship, but a choice to endure it side by side, no matter how fierce the winds or how dark the nights. In that truth lies the kind of strength the West could never erase. And so the image remains. A cowboy and the woman who dared to believe in him, standing hand in hand as the sun rose over a land scarred by battles, yet softened by hope. Their love was not the story of one night. It was the story of forever. And in the harsh silence of the prairie, it spoke louder than any gunshot, louder than any storm, reminding us that even in the dust, a vow can bloom into something eternal. If this story left its mark on you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments, because every voice adds to the legacy of tales that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe if you wish to ride further into the world of stories that reveal the heart of the Old West. And leave a like to carry this flame forward. Just as the cowboy proved, sometimes the smallest gesture, a word, a choice, a promise, can echo longer than a lifetime.